Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Varley Art Gallery's Lunch and Learn series, generously sponsored by the Varley McKay Art Foundation. I'm Alessandra, the Varley's Education Research Assistant, and your host for today's webinar. So we begin today's program by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and their commitment to the stewardship of this land. We acknowledge the communities in Circle, the north, west, south, and eastern directions, the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Seneca, Chippewa, and the current treaty holders, Mississaugas of the Credit Peoples. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure that the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. I'd like to point out a few things before I pass it off to our speaker. There are auto-generated captions available at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording this talk and it will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week. The presenter will speak for about 50 minutes, and then there will be time for audience questions at the end. So please feel free to type those questions in the Q&A section of the chat. Today, we have artist Winnie Truong here with us. Winnie Truong sheds light on the Varley Art Gallery's current exhibition, Field Notes, which features sketches by F.H. Varley from the gallery's permanent collection and contemporary works by the artist. Winnie will reflect on some parallels between her work and those in the collection, touching on the labor of drawing and the creation of botanical forms, both from observation and imagination. She'll also examine the process of creating Meadow II, a large-scale cut paper wall installation, and The Trade, a recent stop-motion animation. Winnie Truong is a Toronto artist working with drawing and collage to explore ideas of identity, feminism, and fantasy, along with a digital art and animation practice that includes public art and community engagement. She has exhibited across Canada, the US, and Europe with solo presentations at Volta New York Art Fair, Pulse Miami Art Fair, and Art Toronto, and is a 2017 recipient of the Chalmers Art Fellowship. Her work is in the collection of the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, Overland Park, Kansas, Doris McCarthy Gallery at the University of Toronto, and the Bank of Denmark and EQ Bank. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Winnie Truong.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone who has visited the show thus far and will be visiting the show hopefully in the near future as life thaws out in Ontario. So let me get the screen share going. There we go. And so we begin. So my work is currently included in a two-person exhibition with a collection of the Varley Gallery of Varley's field sketches. And so the inclusion of my work alongside these studies is really about the power of drawing and the power of observing and physically being in nature, and how there are various aspects or takeaways from that. While Varley's approach is more about observation and collecting these real moments of, parts of nature that catch his eye. For me, it's about also taking in that influence and coming up with new things, either in situ or taking back the influence to my studio and creating something purely from imagination. And so this is a little moment from the tabletop vitrine as you enter the gallery, and it's interspersed with Varley's notebooks and a few of my little odds and ends of cut paper work. So yeah, I'm Winnie Truong. I'm an artist based in Toronto. I graduated from OCAD in 2010 from their drawing and painting program. And since then, my practice has sort of really been about drawing. I'm going to do a whole kind of timeline of how I got to this place of creating these cut paper works, and along with how I got to the place of creating this piece that you see here, which is titled Meadow II. It's actually an installation of these 3D cut paper pieces, and it's sort of like a hanging garden. It echoes a lot of pressed flowers and these moments of, trying to capture nature, but with a bit of a twist through my lens. So, yeah, this is what my work was in 2009 and 2010. So, we're going to try to thread it all together. So I was always working with large scale drawing. And this is a work on paper. It's colored pencils, portraiture. And these pieces are about 6 by 4 feet, all created with colored pencil. And, that's sort of the underlying interest in my practice, is how to create things with these very accessible and, seemingly juvenile tools. So colored pencils, you don't really see in the canon of art history, except again, the relationship with the show is, drawing itself. All the works are drawing from Varley, and it's relegated to preliminary work. And with my art practice, I find it's interesting to create drawings as a sort of monumental final object, when the canon has always the Western canon has always been art history, or in art history has always been about painting and sculpture as sort of the final, project. So for me, it's a really interesting place to create as a woman and as, an Asian woman, to echo the sort of paperwork, and to create something, so I guess intense and monumental with such a fragile substrate. So yeah, this is actually work from my undergrad. And so you can kind of see the process. It's a lot of, drawing from sketches, and yet that line work is still there. Like it's this sort of really meticulous hatching, and then you do it up close. And when you step back, you see that page on the screen there is a little bit of indication of scale. So that's just a page from a magazine. So with this earlier work, it was about creating these portraits, and not necessarily about depicting the person, but taking hair as the subject, and extrapolating that and letting that become the different iterations of form and different, I guess, the main subject that indicates, like, everything from gender to socioeconomic background to all these other things that we would imbue into how we adorn ourselves, and, the importance of ornamentation and how we convey other narratives. So the human face is more a matter of, I guess, an armature on which to build these different conversations about what is beautiful and what is ugly, and that sort of intersection between beauty and discomfort, which I think has followed me through to the work that I do now, even as the subject matter has changed less about hair and towards these more environments that are both birthed by the creatures that I've created, or they're about these figures entangled in this sort of strange nature. And that sort of tangling, I think, starts with the hair as subject matter. And so this is Shelley Duvall. And so this is a bit of a blend of influences. And then that tiny picture there you see is like a 60s women's magazine. And it must be for like pomade or some sort of, beauty thing. And it had all these little flowers in her hair, and she looked so forlorn. And so I inferred this other tension beneath the surface, and I imagined these sort of teeth forms in place of the blossoms. And it's called ornament and correction, and I do like that, again, that sort of tension in the works between the chaos of the teeth growing and then the really carefully placed braces. So this is a group of works that I created very early on, and they were meant to, stand in conversation with one another. So all these talking heads, creating this greater conversation of how we approach these heavily coded ideas of beauty, and given these subjects that exist just outside the realm of possibility. So this is from an art fair in New York. This was a Volta fair in 2011, where I just showed them sort of floating, again, that tension between something so monumental that takes so much time to do, this obsessive process of mark making. So every mark of the colored pencil on paper equals to one strand of hair. So they take like a bit over a month of complete immersion to create. And to me, very early on, I also enjoyed the tension of having them unframed for some time being. It was very delicate and a bit scary. And of course, seeing larger than life heads approach you is a bit scary as well. So yeah, the work has sort of evolved over the last, I guess, almost 13 years since I've been out of school. And so, over the years, this is sort of the midpoint of these large scale color pencil works. It was still very much about hair, very much about creating these forms and possibilities, and slowly growing away from strictly portraiture to depictions of these figures fully immersed, and whether they're birthing these hairy environments that are, it's either a comfort object or it's this tense thing that's wrapping around them and possibly destroying them. There is the work occupies that sort of ambivalent space where I like to leave some up to the viewer to suppose. And, it depends on your reading of the work, but obviously mine is very much about these culling from a lot of experiences I have as a woman. And also, hair is such a heavy conversation within this sort of gendered gendered conversations as well. So as the work kind of grew outward, it sort of formed away from portrait again and really about averting the gaze. So the work expanded more into environment, and this is the largest scale drawing of that series, which was 90 inches by 50 inches, and that was around 2014. To a show in earlier 2013 where I was creating more of these objects and sort of vessels of ornamentation. So starting to play with botanicals very early on and transforming hair into this, of course, it's this dead thing that exists on us. It doesn't cause us any pain when it's removed from us, but how we perceive it when it's removed from the body, it has this very abject, meaning when we see like a wig mashed in the gutter after a club night. It's completely different than when it's on a model's head and adorned in like a hair sort of presentation. So these objects bring those conversations forward while also melding, conversations about craft and women's work and that sort of meticulous weaving and of these imaginary objects created from hair, while also the actual process of drawing with the colored pencil involves almost as much craft and patience, while these are more theoretical objects than actual. And so, working just beyond those objects, I was interested in, bringing in more of the existing nature around me, but hair has always been the sort of, primordial subject from which I create other things with. And so even at this very early residency, one of my first residencies, I was invited to stay for a week at the Drake Devonshire in Wellington, Ontario, and sort of be their artist in residence, work in these public spaces. And while I was working just, at the edge of Lake Ontario in the middle of winter, I was so drawn to the wallpaper and these other, moments of spring that I've longed for, that a lot of the elements that I ended up creating were these figures sort of entangled and blanketed in the nature that I've yearned for, especially as an artist that's working exclusively in these urban environments in a studio. I think a lot of that yearning is very human. And so this is the work that came from that. And it was sort of the springboard for a lot of the future travels that I've done thus far. And so to tie it back to field notes, like a lot of the movement that I have away from the studio has been very fruitful in terms of, creating new influences and being able to just deposit like memories and, physical things that I collect while I'm going through nature in these new environments. So there's a bit of like a constant push and pull from these new ideas that I work with to the others. So this is a large scale drawing that I created in 2015, Fair Feathered Friends. And it's, again, just trying to imagine hair as this sort of, I guess, hybrid thing now, not just a matter of creating these creatures that, defy physical and biological possibilities with their hair, but also melding with nature in that hybridity with nature as well. And then as the work sort of grew, we're literally growing towards the container. And again, this sort of springing of hair and these stalks and slowly blending into floral elements, just creating these environments where especially the female body, all this work, as you can see, since the portraits have been about the sort of tension with environment, whether it's tension or birthing the environment within these femme figures. Yeah. So we're going a little bit further. And I think over the years, I've really seen my approach to and my interest in creating these, I call them women figures, and I spell them WIMMIN, as these really female representing creatures. Maybe that's not the word. Just sort of feminine, sensual forms that exist sort of onto their own. Again, working in a vacuum and having them sort of create these environments that they are both bound to and frolicking amongst. So they're tendrils that are bursting from every kind of orifice. So here we go. And, as I was working with these large scale drawings, 50 by 46, and going really intensely with the detail, it's such a meticulous process. I had to figure out new ways to explore creating studies and creating these sort of creatures as they came to my mind. And so I started working with these digital drawings. So this isn't a print or anything. I started creating these digital layers of almost simulated paper and textures in Photoshop, and just seeing how it would be to cut them out and create different colors and just playing that way. So it's a really backwards way of coming to this conclusion. So working digitally was actually what helped me realize the quickness of these studies working with cut paper. And it wasn't until I started doing residencies more continuously throughout 2016 that I completely flipped from working with these large scale portraits that require so much, I guess, time spent, but while it is time spent and labor intensive, they are very meditative drawings. So doing them requires just having an idea of how I want the form to, I guess, emote, and how I want it to compositionally seem. And once it starts, it's more of a point A to point B of realizing the image that I have in my head. And it doesn't involve the kind of play that sort of digital drawing where I could endlessly edit, change colors, and, every little articulation of a line or a shifting of a layer could create a new possibility. It wasn't until I started doing residencies like this that I was forced to create work at a smaller scale and with a more adaptable way of moving around. So again, I clearly have a thing for winter residencies in Canada. So Doris McCarthy is an artist. She is known for these beautiful paintings of icebergs and nature. And this was actually her home that was endowed to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And they've since run it as an artist residency in Ontario. And so I was lucky enough to do 2 months in 2016, January and February, where I just lived alone in this beautiful artist cottage. So there are so many little quirks, and it very historic. I guess it's been saved historically. So many things were from the 60s, and it's right next to the ravine. And of course, we're on the edge of the cliffs, right? Overlooking the lake or the bluffs. So while I was there, I had actually intended to create these sculpture pieces. I wanted to completely flip the script on the large scale drawings and create works that were 3D and still about paper and about pushing the boundaries of what paper and drawing could mean beyond this really static sort of preliminary drawing image, towards, something that exists in space and of course is created from many layers as well. So again, you can kind of see the different silhouettes that I was looking at, with all the dead plants, because we're obviously in between seasons. So I spent my time actually bringing all these elements into the studio and watching how they laid out, and how the shadows played with them. And so while I was making these paper sculptures, I realized once I flattened them down again, it became this other sort of storytelling device. So it harkens to obviously a lot of cut paper, children's books, illustrations, a lot of Hans Christian Andersen stories and cutouts. So there's this sort of creative element that exists, and there's a draw from, or the seduction of these images where they're kind of cutesy and they are these colorful little silhouettes and forms, but they are also these strange, robust creatures that don't exist, and their anatomy is a little bit wild. They're sensual and bulbous, and yet they're these muscular, strange beings that are entangled in these brambles. So I really enjoyed creating elements like this. So these are, silhouettes that are culled from the environment, but also as I was working with them, they were obviously from fantasy as well, and taking those influences and blending them into these new realities is very interesting to me. Again, as this imaginary, feminist naturalist going into these new landscapes and trying to imagine the creatures that would live within. And again, without these gazeless features, so their eyes are cut out or they're not looking directly into the viewer. Like, I think that that's always been this sort of powerful point about these very otherwise vulnerable beings that I've been creating with this body of work, that you can't get too close to them, and they are not performing for us. They are merely existing and thriving in their own environments of their own making, and we're just lucky enough to observe them. So I've also gone on from there to do a residency in Norway. So I'm like just going to these new places and finding these interesting elements, and also regarding how, across these different distances, there's so much sameness as well. So this is the coolest thing. This was in a little, I guess, inn that we stumbled upon, and they had this handmade lichen chart. I definitely wanted to buy it or steal it, but did not. So I just took a photo of this, and yeah, just seeing these really sodded green roofs and seeing them overgrown really helped me imagine figures sort of exploding in their own environments that way. So this is work that I put together following that, and you can really see how the work has sort of grown and I guess evolved throughout these different influences. So I was also in Japan doing a residency where I was also featured on Japanese TV, and this was a very lush green environment, very humid in the middle of July and August. And I think a lot of these slick sort of struggling bodies evoked that. This is something I just saw in Japan, and it's this beautiful butterfly mount, and seeing it in this deep shadow box has greatly influenced a lot of the dioramas that I've created later on, which we're going to get to. And again, another residency, this time in Sausalito on a converted ferry boat, houseboat. And so this is living in the Bay Area, and in this sort of marshy, sensual, kind of stinky landscape, I've created these sort of swamp women who are like, the colors reflect that. And then there's this sort of like mystery and murkiness of the space that I occupied as well. So this one, I don't recall the title, unfortunately, but it so hopefully shows you how, you know, as we experience new sights and textures and I guess just observations of nature, that these influences and fantasies can kind of overtake us. This is a show called The Sunshine Eaters in Toronto. And so, yeah, for a few years, I was presenting these sort of larger scale cut paper works. And while I am still interested in doing those large scale drawings eventually, because I do enjoy the labor of this, this paper cut, I guess, part of my practice has been such an, I guess, reinvigorating time for me, because the cut paper elements, you know, the process itself is I create these figures that are inspired by just gestures and movements that evoke a sort of tension or a story that I want to tell within the work. Then I also have either bits and pieces that I've created in this drawer of these botanical elements from memory that I've either kept or I create them specifically for this. I use these colored pencils and colored papers. I draw a silhouette of these imagined plant forms. And so I'll draw on the front of them, and sometimes I'll apply them, and I'll draw on the back of them. And as I'm creating them in the studio, they are so playful in that way because they're created from these so many disparate elements. The drawing itself may take, you know, 2 weeks, but it may take a month of playing to just articulate everything just right. So they're really these almost paper dolls because I can articulate each limb to, you know, gesture just to make a slightly different gesture or overlap them in a sort of way that it goes from this sort of embrace to this altercation. And that for me is eternally satisfying. And, you know, it allows me to see the process itself as full of possibilities as opposed to this sort of realization of form, which is a different method of working. So this is called Libra Season, and it was part of the Sunshine Eaters show at On-Site Gallery, which also featured works from Sherry Boyle and Nick Cave, and it was an epic curated show by Lisa Deanne Smith of OCAD, and it sort of involved all these artists that dealt with sort of the environment and the aspects of how these changing environments are creating these new worlds within these artists' visions. And obviously, I would apply that work to, or apply that ethos to my work as well. And so this is the gauntlet. And again, they're almost like getting at each other while these different plants that or this canopy of flowers that they're traipsing through is also the sort of attacking entity. And so the work has kind of gone back and forth. I've also reintroduced cut paper elements to these kind of portrait works, but also winding them as these sort of 3D ornamentations of the art that or the methods I was making with in the past. And yeah, as the work has sort of developed, I'm going to speed these along. I think I have a lot from this show. This was from a exhibition in Calgary at Vivian Art, titled Perennials, and sort of imagining how hair and plant life can be adorned in different ways, and how the relationship between like an unkempt lawn and a cultivated garden can have such specific, I guess, connotations, whereas, and that could apply to grooming and how, you know, women can care for their bodies and how we adorn ourselves. And yet both environments, the garden and this sort of weeded lot, are both teeming with life, and there's beauty in both. And these are all sort of taste assumptions. So this is the last residency I've been on, and this was in 2019, just before the pandemic happened. This was in Gotland, Sweden. I had just had a kid, and we were living in the seaside cottage where I not only got to dive back into creating full time after obviously the maternity lull, but also be imbued in a place during a time of wildflowers and roses and all the different things that are somewhat familiar to us. And you also, when I actually research like a lot of the plants and wildflowers that I see, this funny thing called invasive species arises, and you realize how bonded we are globally through just the transit of humans, and how, you know, these things are able to leave their home and also survive and at the same time take over. But yeah, so I went to this residency with the intention of creating this wall installation of these cut paper elements, knowing that I would have to sort of put them all in my suitcase and leave, but allowing a temporary exhibition of these elements to serve as a kind of diaristic, I guess, not explanation, but a sort of a diary of my time spent there working and imagining just the worlds that are happening just outside our doorstep. Again, through the lens of creating these environments for these sort of women figures and how they manage to survive and thrive and create lives for themselves within these sort of imaginary environments. And so, yeah, it grew to this while I was there. And I had an opportunity to show this piece at Gallery Saw later that winter, which I then added to. So this is Meadow I, and it was the first iteration of this. And I see this installation that is now at the Varley as a sort of ever-growing or ever-expanding collection. So there are pieces that have existed in the current show at the Varley from Sweden and from my other travels, but they've also been added to, and bits have been taken away or will be taken away since. So it very much echoes, you know, how one would grow a garden and how one would collect these elements and press flowers and sort of admire and be immersed in nature in this sort of strange way. And so you can see lots of these hands and sort of creatures, and how over the time, especially with these wall installations, I'm looking for these elements of nature and crossover. So you see hands, you see things that look a little bit like gonads, and even for me, just the act of drawing itself, it still harkens back to a lot of that hairiness and that sort of organic mark making. So even when you look at that plant form on the left, there is this sort of, I guess, organic fiber that comes through, and whether that is hair or like muscle, fascia, that these are all very much living paper things that I've culled and, you know, placed in the gallery is how I imagine it. So beyond creating these very immersive works, I've also started creating this series of dioramas, which I'm kind of simultaneously working with amongst animation and these wall installations. The dioramas and the cut paper works just on paper are still at the forefront of what I've been working on in the studio these days. And so with the dioramas, it's about creating these environments that are complete unto their own. So they're almost like vitrines or terrariums of these, both the figure and the elements towards the edge of the frame. So what we're seeing is like a moment captured in time, and it's very much alive, and almost if you fed it, it would continue to grow and be interacted with, is how I imagine these. So this is from Field Study, the exhibition on at the Varley right now, and this is a glimpse at, you know, how some of these elements have come through from the previous work and how it continues over time. So this is, I guess, of course, the work that I'm most excited about in the show. It took 2 days to install, about a day and a half to install. But yeah, it's also a meditative process in itself. So I brought everything from the studio, all these elements organized by colors and, you know, layered in tracing paper. And once I get to work, it's just about finding these different relationships between the elements, almost kind of culling them by these imaginary genuses as well. So you can see a lot of these, I guess in the middle, they're kind of weedier forms. And then as we oscillate towards the edges, that they're also chromatically kind of telling a story as well. And I guess the last thing I will touch upon is the aspect of animation in the show as well. So for me, drawing, or I guess pushing the boundaries of drawing is a big aspect of what I'm also pursuing with each evolution of my practice. Again, drawing is not this sort of static image on paper. While it could be, it sort of involves anything and everything, whether it's the gesture of drawing or the paper itself. So beyond cut paper, we have this immersive space that drawing can occupy to, you know, these elements within drawing. So all these little paper cut bits and these dioramas, of course, are a huge influence just in the creation of these and in the articulation of all the different moving elements. Like, as I'm actually creating this, before I glue everything on, there is just so much play involved. Like every leaf, every botanical is made from different layers, and I'm rotating them and I'm re-articulating gestures from the hands to those little butterflies and bits. And within the creation of these, there are so many moments of time-based art that are lost. And so simultaneously with the diorama works, in 2018, or in 2017, I applied for the Chalmers Fellowship grant to create animations from my work. So having very little background in how to make a moving image, I took the year off to create moving images of my work and learn how to pursue a more time-based kind of drawing practice. And so with these elements, you can see this is from a very specific commission, but you can see that I've learned since to create these in-camera stop motion animations over time. And a lot of the gestures of, you know, capturing every little movement. So 12, let's say 12 or 24 frames per second, to just the action of drawing. Like, it's very much about the sort of manual labor as well, that again ties into these unseen bits of, I guess, women's work and craft, and that blurry line between, you know, art and craft and art and kitsch that I enjoy. And so, yeah, when they're complete and they are these sort of little vitrines, so that there is a finite bit of space when I'm creating these stop motion environments that speak to the dioramas as well. But it's a way of creating work that is completely immersive, and that I have since pursued like other public art projects with. So now scale is not an issue as well. And it's about creating work just beyond, I guess, the parameters of, you know, what we expect from just going back to the first image of the little sketchbooks and field studies. And, you know, I hope that I continue doing what I do. And I don't know exactly what's next, but I know that I haven't exhausted the possibilities that, all these cut paper elements and animation and dioramas have given me. I think we'll stop there because that was a little bit of everything. And hopefully there are lots of questions, and I will stop my screen share and if I can find my mouse. Oh, there we go.
Thank
Hold
you,
on a
Winnie.
second.
Yeah, no worries.
There we go.
Okay. So I actually have a question
Yes.
about the importance of gesture in your work, in your drawing practice. Even with like the early works where hair was kind of this predominant element, and that seeing the kind of evolution into like plants and the full body, it's like the hair and also these botanicals become like an extension of the figure's featured, almost like another limb. Um, and I guess I just wanted to ask about the importance of gesture and also practices of care in kind of like your representations of these creatures or these women, because it seems like you almost can't tell if they're engaging in some kind of stewardship or care for their environment, or if they are actually caring for themselves, their own bodies in some way, like you mentioned the practices of grooming. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of these gestures, like I think as I've developed these newer drawings and dioramas, so the later works that you've seen with the cut papers of these cut paper women elements navigating their environments, I think it oscillates between these parasitic relationships to these symbiotic relationships. The idea of being a steward is definitely part of it in a stranger way. I think with these worlds, I imagine them really devoid of specifically, I guess, the patriarchy and without the male gaze. So it's bordering on these different conversations of, I guess, environmental kind of feminism or ecofeminism, um, but also that I'm creating these new environments either as a proposition of what happens when we start after the fall, or whether I'm creating these worlds from a new primordial goo that excludes, I guess, like the violence and the perpetration of, or the domination of nature that we're experiencing in this current timeline, and imagining it through this sort of feminist natural lens of observing a world. Or what if there, obviously there are still like tensions and things that are a little bit more ominous. There is an element of danger in some of the new environments, but that they're just starting from a different sort of baseline. But even just as these little gestures, I think that care is such a big part of what the detail and the interest that I have in creating the relationships of the forms on paper, that it's just a part of my instinct and my nature. And yeah.
Yeah, you can certainly tell that your drawings have been like very cared for in their kind of making, in their construction, and the way even the cut elements are like folded and pieced together. It's really beautiful. Could you also speak about the color organization in Meadow II, and how does it relate to any earlier versions of that work?
No, I mean, for that, I've thought about it in almost a rainbow. I imagined these different, I guess, strata of color as we're moving out to these different sort of environments and relationships that would exist to produce that. So, kind of organizing it in almost a taxonomical way by color, and allowing, I guess, the viewer to imagine the different places that these would have been culled from, or the different, I guess, I don't know what I want to say, but the different possibilities that would have to lead to in order for these forms to thrive, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else would like to know what kind of pencil crayons you use.
I use mostly Faber-Castell and Prismacolors, and yeah, about it.
So do you work or think differently about where the final result of a very large outdoor piece might be than you do when working on a smaller scale drawing or shadow box?
Yeah, I think for those outdoor, like public art pieces, the site is so important. And I think because they are these sort of commissioned works, that there is obviously not just a response to environment, but a response to
Mhm.
the purpose of the project. So the one that you saw of the parking lot, that was a very specific commission during the COVID, early COVID days. And that was meant to be outside of the Canada Post sorting plant, and it was, the video itself was about the exchange called interchanges, and was about these different exchanges in natures, pollination, I guess hunting and food delivery and all these different things, that also spoke to what was happening inside the space.
Mm, mm. That's very interesting. Um, could you speak also a bit more about how you, because you mentioned your residency so much, and how the way you perceive and kind of influence your environment also affects the work that you create and the environments that almost like channel through you into these like other worlds made of paper. Could you talk a bit about how you decide or which kind of residencies attract you or where you decide you might want to go?
Yeah, I mean, really, the nature of residencies is there are just so many
Yeah.
different kinds that are offered out there. It really is a numbers game, but the kind of like I'll apply to a lot, and a few will come back to me. And for the most part, the ones that I'm most attracted to are the ones with a bit of a built-in community of other artists working on site, but also that provide more so time and space as the main resource to create. Yeah, as opposed to like a strictly thematic residency. I haven't found one specifically that I wanted to apply to, but I think if the right one comes along, of course, it would be tailored to different things I'd want to reflect on.
Makes sense. Somebody else would like to know if you enjoy being shown alongside the Varley drawings and what you kind of think of that pairing.
Absolutely. I do enjoy the conversation of this sort of obviously a historical figure and this historical Canadian collection, and bringing in a completely different kind of approach to it, which is what I do. I mean, in terms of having that conversation with his works that I think Anna did a wonderful job telling elements of both, plants and animals, and there are also these lone figures, that a few lone figures in the on the wall of drawings of Varley's that I think also echo back a lot of the different figurative forms that are present in the show as well on my end. And I guess a lot of the conversations that I've also had during this presentation about residencies is trying to also find the parallel between this field study element. As a contemporary artist, it's hard to find these or blend these aspects of life with, living in the city, having a studio in the city, and trying to pay for food and shelter as an aspect of being alive and being an artist here. And so these travels is a privilege, first of all, but they also allow for these moments of growth that wouldn't otherwise happen if, sort of kept in captivity in the studio.
Yeah, yeah, that aspect of, because I noticed when you spoke about each of your residencies, how each place or each visit kind of contributed something to your practice or like caused a shift in some kind of way just from like being in those different surroundings. How like there is a reciprocal relationship between us and our environment. Yeah. Um, if there are no other questions, is there anything else you would want to say? I know you You ended your presentation by saying you didn't know exactly what would come next, but can you tell us a bit about what you're currently working on in your studio now?
Yeah, I mean, the last slide is from this week in the studio, so I
Oh,
should have
wow.
mentioned that it was meant to also wrap up, what is currently going on. So I'm working on very large scale dioramas, and the next showing I have of those new works will be at NADA in New York with Patel Brown Gallery, and that will be in May. But yeah, just working on these larger dioramas as a way of creating even more immersive environments. I guess the answer is creating more and more of the worlds that I'm dreaming up.
Yeah, and through these different mediums, like I know the kind of the shift from working just with flat piece, like working with working with cut paper was kind of like the idea of making them sculptural, but then ending up in this place where they're still flat and the elements can still be moved and played with and animated. Now you've like transcended just like you said, moving into more time-based mediums and the scale, you're no longer restricted by just the size of the paper or the limits of your body. So I also wonder, are you planning to do any more, I guess, public art type of commissions, specifically with video?
Um, Not at the moment, but it seems to be that obviously the video aspect is the medium that works for that at the moment as well. But I mean, animation is something that I'd like to create, at least I guess keep the muscle memory of once a year, because it is such a technical process as
Yeah.
well. And just in creating, like, responding to the work with the new animation every so often has allowed me to think about just different ways of creating work as well. And yeah.
It's almost like how you said before, you were making these digital kind of paper mock-ups, and that was kind of
Exactly.
like your form of sketching, um, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to say thank you to Winnie. This was a really enriching talk. Field Notes is on display right now at the Varley Art Gallery. And I'd once again like to thank the Varley McKay Art Foundation for sponsoring Lunch and Learn. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. All
Thank you
right,
again for having me.
no problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Winnie. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
Take care.